Hi, and welcome to the 78th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today, we're going to be talking about revolutionary Iraq, which is Iraq in the period between the fall of the British-aligned monarchy and the rise of the Ba'ath Party. Those of you who are unfamiliar, these are the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the subjects that we are going to be discussing today. I'm going to present this as a lay person who's interested and who cares about the heritage of this part of the world. This is also going to be a secular presentation. I'm going to try and not take sides in the various disputes and questions and issues that are going to be here, but try and give you something more neutral. And of course, like all topics in Middle Eastern history, this topic is going to be one that is divisive and difficult. So let's be respectful of all different kinds of opinions. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. If the question isn't directly pertinent, I will put it in the question and answer section. We're going to have two of those because there are two different presentations. And during those question and answer sections, you can raise your hand and I will call on you and we can have a conversation if you prefer to ask your question out loud. I like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up, and a 201 meaning that if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. I also have a 2-hour hard stop, so if I don't get to all the slides I want to show at the end of 2 hours, it'll just roll into the next week, and what do you know, it'll be a perfect continuation because next week is going to be the literal fallout from what we're going to discuss in the latter part today. When I put dates below a person, those are their years of service. If it's a political figure, if it's a thought leader, it's their lifespan. And this is a recording that you can watch later at our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all the updated videos on all of our different series, and you can be updated in real time. We also would encourage you to join our meetups. The meetup link is right there, and you can be part of these conversations when they happen. So that way you can ask your questions, your comments, and be a part of the experience. And of course, we have premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube, which all cost premium money. And that apparently does not grow on trees. And while we will continue to offer this service for free because we think that Middle Eastern history and history in general is so exciting, we would hope that if you enjoyed your experience, that you chip in a little bit to cover the costs of those overheads. All right. And some things that we're going to see throughout the revolutionary period and throughout the wider Iraqi period as well are some thoughts that we need to put out there. The first one is that, right, during the Arab Cold War, you have the states that are Western aligned, states like Israel, Jordan, Iran, and Turkey, and you have the states that are revolutionary, right? You have the states like Egypt and Egypt, which is a revolutionary state. Syria and Lebanon will become that or are moving in that direction, and Iraq is moving in that direction too. And we're going to see the effects of that Arab Cold War on the development and growth of Iraq. We're also going to see numerous coups continually occurring and power increasingly falling to a smaller and smaller cadre of officials who are going to be acting against each other. And that constant action against each other is going to lead to paranoia by leaders of the government. And especially as we get into the Ba'athist period next week, we're going to see how that affects the population as well. Another thing to realize is that a lot of what we know about this period and the Saddam period afterward comes from sources that are garbled, that came out of the country, that are very biased. And so to the extent that we know what happened, we should take it with a grain of salt because of the way that we know this information. We're also going to see that Iraq is sort of at the crossroads of the Arab world, where they have a significant portion of the population, roughly 15–20%, that aren't Arab. And so because of that ethnic and religious diversity, you're going to have a tug within Iraq between those who are more aligned to a Arab perspective and ruling Iraq as an Arab country in collaboration with other Arab countries, or those who see it as something else, something different. And are interested in pivoting more towards that sort of lens of something that's Iraqi specifically. We're going to see the imprisonment of rivals and an increasingly harsh police state. And we're going to see that the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union plays directly into the Iraqi perspective and into what will happen in the country over the course of this decade and change. So one of the things that's worth pointing out is that a significant portion of northern Iraq, the Kurdish regions of Iraq, was autonomous during the Ottoman period, and that autonomy ended up resulting in a number of Kurdish principalities existing in those areas of Iraq. I also want to point out, if you look very closely, that the area around the Persian Gulf is completely controlled by the Ottoman Empire at this point of highest extent. But the territories of Kuwait are part of an autonomous region in the Qatif, but the islands are part of the governorate of Basra. And we're going to see contentions over the borders of Kuwait and the organization of Kuwait as we move forward. And it's an important point that these borders are not as clear as we would like them in this regard. There's a point that the Kurdish didn't have their own country, and that is entirely correct during this period. But we should not forget how autonomous the Ottoman Empire was as soon as you get far away from Constantinople. The ability of the Ottoman sultans to enforce their will attenuates incredibly with distance. This is not a modern state with long distance communications and effective long distance transport and effective militaries and all these kinds of things. They relied on local families and local tribes in order to keep order. And so those areas that were autonomous and where the Kurdish Agha had their power, they had a significant amount of power within the context of a larger Ottoman state. There's a question, unintentionally federalist. I guess you could say that. I would say it's just feudalism. This is the same thing that existed in Europe. In all European feudalist states, the further away you were from the core, the more the independent barons and lords could assert their will. And it's only when you had the rise of absolutism that you began to see the unification of the periphery into the core. And that simply didn't happen in the Ottoman world until the 19th century. In fact, Iraq in the 18th century was ruled by a slave class, the Mamluk, but these were Mamluk of Georgian extraction. So these were individuals who still actually spoke Georgian. They were Muslim by religion, so they had been converted, and they controlled the three vilayats of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. The three vilayats or governorates that compose the majority of Iraq today. And these Georgians were known at certain points for having a relatively prosperous economy, but by and large, they kept Iraq in sort of a position of relative weakness in the region. But they were militarily strong enough to keep away the Zand Persians, for example, during the siege of Basra in 1779. There's a question of were these the same Mamluks that fought Genghis Khan in the 1200s? No, those were primarily Circassian and Kipchak. Circassians come from what is today Caucasian Russia, and Kipchaks come from what is today Western Kazakhstan, and they were in Egypt, and that dynasty was incorporated into the Ottomans when the Ottomans conquered Egypt in 1517 as Neo-Mamluks, and they became the dominant dynasty in Egypt until they were removed by Napoleon in 1799. So so those are the Egyptian Mamluks, and they fought Genghis Khan, and well, technically not Genghis Khan, they fought Hulagu Khan, who was his grandson. But Though that's those Mamluks. The Georgian Mamluks are completely different. So, like everywhere else, we've talked about the Nahda, or the Renaissance in Arab thinking, and that's split between the Islamic modernists and the nationalists. Within the Iraqi context, the Muslim modernists failed and the Arab nationalists won. And in particular, one of the ideas that became very popular in Iraq was the idea of Arab exceptionalism by Al-KAWEKEBI. And Al-KAWEKEBI's view was that the Arabs were special. They were a chosen nation because God had given to them the Quran. And so you can see in his book al-Qura, or Mother of the World, I guess you could translate it, the organization of the first Islamic Renaissance. And he outlines how the process of Islamic jurisprudence brought the Arabs into a civilizational period, and that this was the gift of the Arab people to the world and why the Arab people deserve to be dominant. There's a question of if this is similar to the Jewish claim of being the chosen people. It is similar in the fact that they are claiming chosenness, and there's a long tradition in many different religious and political spheres of people claiming chosenness, because if you are chosen, you are therefore superior to all those who are not chosen, or at least that's the perception from a political perspective. In the Jewish case, the Jews argue that they were chosen by God because they had a specific religious mission in the world. From the perspective of Al-KAWEKEBI, the Arabs were chosen because they were innately better. The Arabs were the ones who could export this political ideology with its religious adornment. So, but it doesn't come from the same place. Al-KAWEKEBI doesn't say that God specifically gave the Arabs this mission, but he implicitly gave it to them by giving them the Quran and the traditions that went along with it. There's a question, so the Jews and Arabs are enemies? Not really. I would say that from KAWEKEBI's perspective, Jews exist, they just don't have this mission. And I would say from the Jewish perspective, non-Jews exist, they just don't have that mission. So it's more of, you don't have the responsibility to play in our sandbox. So when World War I came around, the Mesopotamian campaign resulted in Iraq coming under British occupation, and British troops were able to bring Iraq under their control by March of 1917. We talked about this more in depth in episode 45 and 46, when we talked about World War I. And part of that was that the British aligned themselves with the Sharifian dynasty. In particular, you can see Abdullah, the son of the Sharif of Mecca. His elder brother, Faisal, would come to be the king of Iraq, following the Treaty of Versailles and the creation of the Mandate. All of this we discussed in some of the in episode 58 on British Iraq. Now, the northern part of Iraq, the Vilayat of Mosul, it was not clear whether that would become part of the Mandate of Iraq or not. It eventually did. But there was certainly a contest of power between the nascent Turkey, led by Mustafa Kemal, and the British in northern Iraq. And of course, the reason why Mosul was contentious was that it had a significant amount of oil, and the British wanted to be able to exploit that. Eventually, the British were able to acquire it. And accordingly was able to incorporate that region into Iraq. Now, the reason why Mustafa Kemal wanted to bring that region under Turkish control is that, in his view, the Kurds and the Turks were the same people, and since that was a Kurdish majority region, it should be part of his Turkish state. There's a question of when did British ships turn from coal to oil? I don't know the exact date, but it's just before World War One. Maybe 1906, 1910, something like that. When the British tried to assert control, you had a situation where the Ayatollah, like Mirza Muhammad Taqi Shirazi, began to galvanize Shiites and Sunnis as well in attacking the British outposts. And it's actually one of the few cases in Iraqi history where the Sunnis and the Shiites were aligned against aligned in terms of their government position, and they revolted all throughout Iraq, including areas like Karbala, Kufa, and Najaf, which have Shiite majorities, and areas like Samarra and Fallujah and Baquba in the north, which have Sunni Arab majorities. And it took the British cooperation with the Iraq levies, which were British conscripted soldiers, mostly of Assyrian extraction, combined with British air power to put down the rebellion. Now, of course, since this was the early period of air power, local protesting and rebelling groups didn't have access to it. So then we get to the Kingdom of Iraq. So following the failure of Faisal to succeed in Syria, he was evicted by the French, the British gave him control of Iraq. And they also gave him Gertrude Bell, who was probably the most famous British attaché in the Middle East in terms of her knowledge of the Arab situation and her being on a first-name basis with a number of the both Sunni and Shiite leaders. And the Kingdom of Iraq maintained a very pro-British perspective, generally speaking, along with cultivating a prime minister who did the same, that's Nouri al-Said. Starting in the 1920s, we also see the beginnings of a Kurdish nationalism. As I pointed out, the Kurds did not have independence under the Ottomans, but they had a significant degree of autonomy, and they had resisted the attempts in the late 19th century by the Ottomans to try and limit that autonomy. As the British were moving into the region, the British were also trying to limit that autonomy, and so you had rebellion from Mahmoud Barzanji and the Kurdish National Army that developed to protect his kingdom of Kurdistan. Ironically, because the Turks were still angered about the Mosul question, Shafik Özdemir, who was a Turkish general, was sent to the Kingdom of Kurdistan to assist Mahmoud Barzanji in resisting the British. Eventually, Barzanji was defeated, though, and sent into exile. But the hope that the Kurds had at that time for independence remained something that remained with a number of the Kurdish clans, despite their being overrun. There's a question of where was Barzanji. He was first in exile in India. He returned to Iraq at a later point. Now, the British increasingly devolved power to the Iraqis in a way that would retain functional British control. Probably the most famous situation was the creation of the Majlis al-Ayyan, or the Congress of Deputies, or the Congress of Notables, which was an Iraqi-made legislative assembly that would come together and discuss issues on the country. So it was something where the Iraqis did have some control over their own policy, but it was really the British who would implement any of the actions taken by the king. So when King Faisal died in 1933 and was succeeded by King Ghazi, there was a strong feeling from the Iraqi people that something might change, especially with regards to the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930 that guaranteed this British ability to impose itself in Iraqi affairs. King Ghazi had released numerous radio broadcasts from the Qasr al-Zuhur that were anti-British in terms of his orientation, and he increasingly tried to move away from following the British to the letter. In April of 1939, he had an accident where he got into a car accident and died. most people at the time believed, and I believe correctly, that he was assassinated by the British, and that this was the way that they were able to remove him from power and install instead his brother as a regent, and install his son, who was a young boy, as the next king, King Faisal II. One of the assertions of Iraqi independence that occurred under King Ghazi was the attack on the Assyrians. As I pointed out, the Assyrian levies were a conscripted force of Assyrians that fought alongside the British in both the Revolution of 1920 and in other later attacks throughout Iraq, which is why the Iraqi military, as soon as it had autonomy in 1933, was launched by Bakr Siddiqui against these Assyrians and attacked numerous of their villages throughout the northern part of Iraq. The massacre is called the SIMELE massacre because many of the Assyrians fled to the town of SIMELE, where they were promised protection from the Iraqi military and the Kurdish irregulars that were hounding them, because the Kurds and Assyrians had a long history of enmity as well. But when they got to Simele, the leaders of the city allowed the Kurds and the Iraqi soldiers to come in and massacre the Assyrians there. We also see Shiite revolts throughout the 1930s and a Yazidi revolt in 1935, all of them put down by Siddiqui as well. A lot of these dealing with the fact that for many Shiites, there was no effective way for them to become integrated into the Sunni-dominated political apparatus. And as farming in southern Iraq became more and more difficult, and the population began to rise, Shiites felt that they had no other recourse. Again, all of this is discussed in much more depth in the discussion on the British Iraq. And so there's a question of what kind of produce is Iraq known for. Iraq actually used to grow a lot of cotton historically, but in terms of food, Iraq they grow wheat, they grow oranges and other kinds of citrus. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. It's the kind of things you would expect in a warm climate like that. All right, so with regards to the British, you have really three different responses. The first is that you have a pro-British response, right? Which was the response of the monarchists and their defenders, that they wanted to continue having a strong alliance with the British and a pro-Western perspective. And these groups tended to enforce the current political structure, which was a political structure where Sunni Arabs were dominant. You also had an Iraqi nationalist perspective, which is the idea that there was a unitary Iraqi identity that superseded all the ethnic and religious divisions of the country, and that Arabs and Kurds should work together across their religious spectra, but that Iraq should reject a wider position in the Arab world. And then, of course, Arab nationalism, which is the opposite. The Arabs should be the dominant group in Iraq, and they should federate with other Arabs throughout the world in order to expand Iraqi power. Once we get through World War II, and Iraq, as you could see, and I discussed more in depth in episode 61, in episode 60, had a very complex situation in World War II. They had a coup d'etat, an invasion, and so on. But where Iraq really begins to change is in the post-war environment. And in the post-war environment, the Iraqi Communist Party begins to show an incredible amount of strength. They respond to the massive economic inequality that a lot of Iraqis are feeling. And they offer a fundamentally different perspective than the perspective offered by Nouri al-Said, who's the prime minister to the monarchy. And one that would allow Iraqis to manifest their own will. And so you have what's called the AL-WAPBA, or the National Uprising, that occurred in January of 1948, led by the Communist Party, where Iraqis all over the country protested for better wages, protested for more autonomy and independence, and a change in the governing structure to give more power to the Majlis al-Ayan, the Congress of Deputies. And it seemed for a short while that the communists actually could be the dominant political force in Iraq. But then they shot themselves in the foot, because the Communist Party of Iraq was directly connected to the Soviet Union and the Communist International. And the view of the Communist International was that the state of Israel was going to become a socialist state or a communist state in the Middle East, and the Soviet Union ordered all communist parties to support the promotion and development of the state of Israel. And for the Iraqi communists, that was a death sentence, because as popular as they had been when protesting for workers' rights, they became equally as unpopular when trying to support Israel's existence when Israel declared independence in May of 1948. And so because of this, the monarchy was able to seize control, and the communists ended up having to go underground. That said, their cells still continue to exist, and we're going to see their influence in the following decades. There's a question of how did the USSR exert authority over Iraq? They didn't exert authority over Iraq in the case of the Al-WAPBA uprising in the Iraqi Communist Party. The Iraqi Communist Party took orders from Moscow as part of Communist International. It's the same way that political parties respond to other leaders of the same political party in other countries. Yeah, it wasn't enforced or anything. They made the choice. Now, Iraq was involved in the war against the Jewish state, and in fact, Nouri al-Said tried to at least cut into his unpopularity by being vehemently anti-Zionist. Iraqi soldiers were mobilized against the state of Israel primarily on the Jordanian front, and to the extent that they were in the northern lobe of the West Bank. Despite this, Iraqi soldiers were far worse equipped than the Jordanian soldiers were, because the Jordanian soldiers still had British officers in their Arab Legion. As we get into the 1950s, what ends up happening is that there's a great fear among the Western states that communist power will begin to expand into the Middle East. And so you have the situation where the Baghdad Pact is formed by the British with American direction in 1955, based in Iraq, seeing Iraq as the first Arab state in the crosshairs of the Soviet Union. It's certainly the Arab state closest to the Soviet Union. And therefore to create an American and British bulwark against Soviet influence in the region. It was a natural extension of the monarchy's pro-British perspective. But that said, other rulers in the region were making it much harder for Iraq to continue under British influence, especially when it came to Iraq's oil resources, which were controlled still by the Iraq Petroleum Company. Now, it's something that we didn't mention directly, but if we go back to this slide, you can see the creation of the Turkish Petroleum Company or the Iraqi Petroleum Company. The two are the two different names for the same thing. And it was not controlled in any way by Turks or Iraqis. So make of that what you will. It was controlled by a consortium of roughly 75% British companies, 25% French companies, and a small 5% consortium was owned by a single individual Armenian who was a British citizen, Kalust Gulbenkian. There is a question of what was the name of the British oil company that had monopoly over Iran's oil pipelines during Mossadegh's reign, and that was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company or the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The two names for the same thing, and you can see that that company owns 47.5% of the Iraqi Petroleum Company as well, meaning that they're invested on both sides of the Zagros Mountains. when Iran nationalized its petroleum, it sent shockwaves throughout the Middle East because it was the first time that there had ever been an attempt to nationalize anything. Remember that Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal would not be until 5 years later. And Iraqis were of the view that nationalization should come to them as well in order for them to use that oil wealth to improve their economy. There's a question, you said Israel declared independence. Yes, Israel declared independence on 14th of May, 1948. There was a speech given by Ben-Gurion where they said, we are an independent Jewish state, and the rest of it. So Iraq during the period of Nouri al-Said was also expansionist. Remember that he's operating from the perspective of a pro-British policy. So the British were interested in an expanding power based in Baghdad, one that they could control and understand. But his views were ultimately thwarted by Adib Shishakli in Syria and by Hussein ibn Talal in Jordan being able to hold their own against the Iraqis. The pro-Western perspective that existed in Iraq was further subject to problems when it came to the Suez crisis, because this was a crisis that directly pitted Britain against the Arab world. In this case, the British were trying to, along with the French, prevent the nationalization of the Suez Canal. And the Egyptians wanted to nationalize it as a show of their own control of the territory. And the Arab nationalism that Gamal Abdel Nasser was spreading was incredibly powerful in terms of convincing people across the Arab world, including in Iraq, of the validity of his arguments. So Nouri al-Said was stuck in a very unenviable position. Because of the alliances that Britain had constructed, such as such as CENTO, such as the Treaty of 1930, the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930 and its amendments, he was required to be an ally of the British against the Egyptians, which would have been absolute suicide. And so he played neutral and ostensibly sent soldiers to Jenin in the West Bank in order to intervene on the Arab behalf if it were necessary, stressing the if, because those troops didn't intervene in anything. And it was clear because of the way that the crisis ended up being resolved, with the nationalization occurring and with the Americans forcing the British, French, and later the Israelis to stand down, that Nasser had ideologically won the battle and Nouri al-Said's days were numbered. Further complicating matters was the fact that there's a question if the British evacuated and monitored after 1947. I think you mean after 1956. No, the British were out. It became Egyptian controlled. There is international monitoring of the Suez Canal to make sure that any ship can go through. But I mean, even after Egypt nationalized it, there were issues with both Iranian and Israeli boats being refused passage through the Suez Canal. So, but Nasser scored another diplomatic victory when Syria and Egypt united into one country. And that union would result in a 3-year control by Egypt of Syria. And we talked about that in our discussions, both of Egypt and Syria in previous discussions. What's important to point out here is that as a reflexive action, the kingdoms of Iraq, right, ruled by Faisal II, at least in name, although you can see there he's still a young kid, and Nouri al-Said as his prime minister is doing most of the heavy lifting, and King Hussein, unified into the Hashemite Union. And this would ostensibly be something that the British would be in favor of. There's one catch. Nouri al-Said's view, and the view of many Iraqis, of that time and later, and we'll see this as a recurring theme, believe that Kuwait is part of Iraq. And so they didn't believe the Hashemite Union should only be the Kingdom of Iraq and the Kingdom of Jordan, but should also include the Emirate of Kuwait as a member of the Union. And the British felt that this would be a violation of their sovereignty over Kuwait, because Kuwait, under an agreement signed in 1899, was subject to British control until 1961. And so because of that, the British didn't support the Hashemite Union. So if we go back a little bit to 1952, what ended up with Nasser in power was what was called the Free Officers Movement, where a number of military officers who were inspired by the ideas of Arab nationalism and Arab socialism launched a coup d'etat against what had at that time been the Kingdom of Egypt and took power in 1952. You can see Mohammed Naguib, who was the ringleader, and Gamal Abdel Nasser right next to him, who would replace him in 2 years as the dominant voice of Arab and pan-Arab nationalism. But this idea of an officer's coup against a monarchy was not lost on other areas in the Middle East. There was an attempt in 1957 to overthrow the Jordanian monarchy, and there would be an attempt now on the 14th of July in 1958 to overthrow the Iraqi monarchy. Now, the irony, of course, was that Abdul Karim Qasim, who is the general you can see in the middle on the right-hand side picture, was ordered by Nouri al-Said to send Iraqi troops to Jordan in order to protect it, ostensibly from the United Arab Republic, which was the combination of Syria and Egypt together, and to prevent Iraq or Jordan from falling to them. What ended up happening is that Abdul Karim Qasim seized the opportunity to work with other members like Abdussalam Arif, who you can see just to his left-hand side, and other free officers to just overthrow the government. He was passing through Baghdad anyway, so it didn't arouse suspicion. But he attacked Nouri al-Said, Faisal II, and other members in the government, like Abdalillah, who was the regent. Their bodies were thoroughly mutilated and cast in front of the Iraqi population to show that they had been removed and that Iraq was now becoming a republic in the vein of the Egyptians who had founded a republic on the remains of their kingdom. And of course, in Jordan, this was taken very negatively because it was a possible end of the Jordanian monarchy. It ended up not being, and it has a lot to do with Hussein's character and his ability to sort of bend with the wind in a way that Faisal II and Nouri al-Said really couldn't. But now we had a coalition of free officers in power in Iraq who were going to dictate policy. And one of the fundamental things is we're going to see that this coalition of individuals does not hold together. One of the fundamental issues that they had was that while they knew that they wanted a republic and they knew that they wanted something that would be separate from a Western perspective, they didn't know what they affirmatively wanted. And each of them had very different ideas. The coalition breaks down into three general categories. Abdul Karim Qasim himself is an Iraqi nationalist, believing that all the different peoples of Iraq should come together to create one Iraqi state. Part of that probably comes from the fact that he had mixed parentage. One of his parents was a Shiite Arab, one of his parents was a Sunni Arab. And so he identified with both communities. In fact, the Shiites of Iraq identified with Abdul Karim Qasim more than any other political figure between the 1920s and the current Iraqi government in the post-Iraq war situation, because almost all the leaders have been Sunni from that point. The fact that he was Shiite in any stripe led a lot of Shiites to identify with him. The next group were the Nasserists. The Nasserists believed in a pan-Arab solution, that the Arab countries should come together into one Arab state through negotiation and agreement, and then they should rule together as one contingent with a non-aligned foreign policy. You then had the Ba'athists, who were a little bit more socialist in terms of their political leaning. Also Arab nationalist. They believe the government should be aligned according to Arab principles, but they were less concerned with unification with other states and more interested in maintaining a strong military apparatus. One of the differences between Nasserists and Baathists also was that Baathists were willing to tolerate the existence of other political parties. In fact, the Baathist political theory is that you need multiple political parties to achieve consensus. Of course, these political parties should, in truth, be controlled by the Baathists and should never pose an electoral danger to the Baathists. The Baathists should always be first among these parties. But those other parties are necessary for consultation and development. The Nasserists believed that only Nasser's voice was necessary. And so, since Abdul Karim Qasim was the leader of the revolution on July 14th, he was the one who got to set Iraq's policy first. And he did that as early as 1958. Making key overtures that would change the way Iraq was both perceived and would enact its own legislation. But I guess we're going to have to find out more about that next week, because we are at the witching hour. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat, and I will explain a little bit about who we are. We are History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard. You have been watching Middle Eastern Islamic History, which is Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. And next week, we will pick up from this point and discuss the development of Abdul Karim Qasim's government, the government of the Arif brothers, the government of the early Baathists like Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, and as far as we can into the reign of Saddam Hussein. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to take off the July 4th week. So we're not going to meet on July 5th, but on July 12th, we will come back and we will finish Iraq, starting hopefully with the American-led invasion in 2003 and continuing through the present, including things like Islamic State and so on. After Iraq, we'll probably pan over to Turkey for a few weeks, and we'll begin to close out these seminars. We also have Asian philosophy with Jason Peng, European Union security that I and Aaron do on occasion. We have Powerful Women in Dead Languages by Jane Prendergast and John Maloney. There should be an episode coming up this month of each of those. And we've got our short run series like the Russo-Ukrainian War, where we'll probably have an episode on Saturday. I want to say July 8th, but that's open to discussion. Of course, you don't have to keep up with our current series. You can see our older series, and our older series are all finished. You can see them and examine all those different kinds of things. Stuff as strange as, are Tolkien's dwarves Jews? What is the history of sport? What's the history of wine? What are some battles in World War II, like Kursk and others? And so I encourage you to go to our YouTube page. The link is on the page right here, and you can see those presentations. All right. So there's a question of where can you watch episode 58? You can watch all of those episodes at the YouTube link that you can see here, where it says please subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's a question of how arbitrary were the boundaries considering Ottoman control. The boundary between Iraq and Kuwait was not the result of Ottoman control. The border between Iraq and Kuwait was a result of the British empowering the autonomous Kuwaiti sultans to take more territory, and then the British would protect that. So it's not as if those are exact Ottoman borders. And as I pointed out, the islands on the northern part of Kuwait are actually part of Basra Vilayet in the Ottoman period. Of course, that doesn't mean that Iraq has the right to them at present, but it means that there is some historicity underlying Iraq's claim. It's not just something that was done for the sake of aggrandizement or something like that. Although that's certainly part of the reason why it was there. There's a question of if the British evacuated or monitored after 1947 with Israel. Israel was also pushed out of the Canal Zone in 1957, because I think you meant 57 instead of 47. In 1957, the Americans demanded that the Israelis leave, or they would cancel a number of financial payments that the United States makes to Israel. And so the Israelis complied. What was put in there instead was the United Nations Emergency Force, which occupied the area until they were ejected by Gamal Abdel Nasser in anticipation of the Six-Day War in 1967. So Egypt permitted international groups to maintain the canal as long as it was under Egyptian control. So the British did not have direct enforcement. In fact, the Suez Canal incident is probably the watershed moment of where the United States replaced the British and the French as the dominant world or imperial power. There's a question of what international agency monitors the Suez Canal to ensure safety. I don't know the exact name of the international agency. There's a question of, I know this is a 101 or 201 level, but I feel a lot of this is very informative, but reminds me of my ignorance. Look, there's a lot of information to remember, so not worried. That's why I try to cover both the 101 and the 201 stuff. There's the point that the series is coming to an end. The series is not coming to an end soon. I still have probably about 8 weeks left. But you know, I have a life and a wife, and or I'm going to have a wife. And if I continue this series, I might not have a wife. So something for me to look forward to as well. But let's see. There's a point that the British Navy needed oil, which is why they had such an interest in the Middle East in the beginning of the 1910s and 1920s. That is absolutely the case. The dominant source of petroleum that the British knew about in the 1910s was in Russia. And Russia could not be counted on as a reliable ally, especially with the rise of the Soviet Union. So they needed alternative oil sources. And so the maintenance of those oil sources was critical to British survival as an empire. And that's where the British are coming from when they are promoting this idea of full and complete control of Iraqi resources, Iranian resources, and so on. It doesn't make it any easier to swallow for the local population that is having their resources extracted that way. One of the functional differences is that Britain was actually a very coal dense place. So when British ships were running on coal, Britain was actually resource secure. It's the shift to oil, which is far more useful than coal because you can store it more effectively, and it provides more energy when burnt. That led to Britain being energy insecure and using its imperial power as a way of collecting the resources that it would need to survive. There's a question, did the British leave the Russians out of Versailles so they could have the Sykes-Picot agreement to cut up the Middle East for oil, and the French as well? No, the Russians were not invited to Versailles because they didn't win the war. The Russians signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1917, which was their separate peace with Germany. And the Allies considered that because the Russians had bowed out of the war, they weren't entitled to negotiate the terms. In fact, the Russians were invited very late to Versailles and had terms dictated to them by the Versailles Commission. So it was a very different situation. Also, the Russians, in 1916, when Sykes-Picot was being discussed, a piece that people forget is that Sykes and Picot met in St. Petersburg under the direction of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov. So the Russians absolutely were involved in Sykes-Picot. They just didn't get what they wanted out of it because they gave up the war. And what they wanted was something entirely different than the Middle East. They wanted control of Constantinople. And this goes back to the Russian claim, the Russian imperial claim, that they are the third Rome. First there was Rome, then there was Constantinople, then there was Moscow. And so by controlling Constantinople, Russia would secure its place as the inheritor of the second Rome being the third Rome. And they would also get control of the warm water ports all along the Black Sea with direct connection to the Mediterranean because they control Constantinople.
Yeah, I don't know which slide it was, but it did show, I guess, post Baghdad Treaty, a map kind of showing Soviet influence spreading, you know, the sort of dominant.
This one, okay.
That's it. And I noticed that Afghanistan had the top corner kind of disputed or split, and I was wondering about, I guess, Ukraine, but more about the Afghanistan.
I'm actually not sure what we're talking about here because the borders of Afghanistan in this map are the same as the borders of Afghanistan that exist today. The way that arrow lands, and just to be clear, Afghanistan is the one that sits just east of Iran, just north of Pakistan. So it's not any of the former Soviet republics that are covered by the arrows. And the rightmost arrow, its point is on Tajikistan. And so you can see the two sort of lobes of Tajikistan. And then the second rightmost arrow is on Turkmenistan. Does that help clear it up? Both of those were part of the Soviet Union at the time. This is a modern map which includes this. Like, I didn't design the map. There's a point here that I thought the Russians lost 20 million soldiers in war against Hitler. Wrong war. That was World War II. And the Russians absolutely were part of the peace negotiations at the end of World War II, but Versailles was the end of World War I. So that's why Russia didn't get Constantinople, because Turkey was neutral in World War II and therefore irrelevant to the Russian aims. And then after World War II, Turkey became part of NATO in 1949, and therefore the Russians couldn't push their claims in Turkey. In fact, in July, when we get to Turkey, we will discuss exactly how Turkey integrated into NATO and why that was so critical for Turkey not losing its easternmost provinces. Because as you can see right on this map, those easternmost provinces are butting up right against the Soviet Union. There's a point that the Brest-Litovsk terms were overturned. Yes, they were, but they weren't overturned in Russia's favor. They were overturned in order to implement Wilson's idea of turning Eastern Europe into a number of smaller states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, which was not in Russia's interest either. Russia wanted to control those territories. Germany wanted to control those territories. And under the Wilsonian idea, neither of them would. I think that covers everything. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'll see everybody next week. All right.
I'll post the slides on the on our YouTube channel. If you guys join there, I'll post the slides in the community tab.
Okay, that works. And you
Okay.
have all my presentations, so you can just upload them. All
Thank
right.
you.
All right. Bye, everybody. But just so you guys know, my slides don't actually have notes on them. Like, it's not like you could, that if you had the slides, that you could do the presentation. I see the same slides you do. I just remember from the pictures what I want to talk about. Bye.